Lauer. If an American president had an adulterous liaison in the White House and lied to cover it up, should the American people ask for his resignation? Hillary. Well, they should certainly be concerned about it. Lauer. Should they ask for his resignation? Hillary. Well, I think that if all that were proven true, I think that would be a very serious offense. That is not going to be proven true. But there wasn't just smoke. There was fire. It wasn't just a triumph for Drudge. It was a triumph for the truth seeker seeking to challenge the insurmountably complex media behemoth that over time had tried to kill a legitimate story for political purposes. Drudge leaked it little by little by little. And when they started to attack him over the course of the next few months, that was when Drudge dropped the cigar story as a fuck you to the Democrat media complex. On August 22, 1998, Drudge bombshelled. She had sex with cigar. Media struggles with shocking new details of White House affair. Again, he headlined that the story contained graphic descriptions. In a bizarre daytime sex session that occurred just off the Oval Office in the White House, President Clinton watched as intern Monica Lewinsky allegedly masturbated with his cigar. It has been learned that several major news organizations have confirmed the shocking episode and are now struggling to find ways to report the full Monica Lewinsky-Bill Clinton gross-out. Clinton's carefully crafted media defense was going down, and Drudge was dismantling it as brilliantly as anyone in media history. But the Democrat media complex isn't enormously powerful because they give up easily. Over the course of the next 8 months, they took an open and shut case of sexual harassment, of perjury, of intimidation of witnesses. They took that epic slam dunk and used a coordinated media propaganda campaign of monumental proportions to split the country apart. They went after all their political enemies to try to draw blood regardless of what the infraction was. They used the media, a critical part of the complex, to legitimate it. Over the next 8 months, I learned all I needed to know about the ethics of journalism. The rules were created by the left to be applied exclusively as a weapon against the right. For the next 8 months, the Clinton administration and their media parrots devised a strategy that assessed, through polling, every possible aspect of the story. They asked the American people, what do you feel about the intimidation of Monica Lewinsky and Linda Tripp not to testify truthfully in the Paula Jones civil trial? We don't like that. What do you think about the president lying under oath? We don't like that. What do you think about the president lying to Donna Shalala and the rest of his cabinet? We don't like that. What do you think about the exploration of the president's sex life? We don't like that. Ah, said the Democrat media complex. Good. There's our wedge. They crafted a wedge from Clinton's sex life, and they went to their messengers in the intellectual circles to shove that wedge between Americans' shoulder blades. They knew that most Americans still thought that Clinton was a liar and a sexual predator, but they knew that if they could only convince Americans that everybody lies about sex, everything would turn out fine for their man, no matter how hypocritical and manipulative they were being to save him. They started with the classic leftist tactic. The politics of personal destruction applied to Lewinsky. This effort was spearheaded by Sidney Blumenthal, a former mainstream media journalist. According to Christopher Hitchens, who testified before Congress in 1999, Blumenthal attended a Washington luncheon soon after the revelations broke, at which Mr. Blumenthal stated that the president was the victim of a predatory and unstable sexually demanding young woman. In other words, Blumenthal used his Rolodex to distribute the dirt that the reason Bill Clinton was in the proximity of Monica, with whom he did not have sexual relations, was because she was a stalker. In fact, Blumenthal used the word stalker several times during a March 19, 1998 luncheon at the Occidental Restaurant in Washington, D.C., explaining that this version of the facts was not generally understood. Blumenthal later blamed Lewinsky herself for this version of the story. In his book, The Clinton Wars, he stated, beginning with Isikoff's publication of the talking points on January 21st, in which Lewinsky called herself a stalker. Newspapers around the country and all the television networks and cable stations expanded upon the stalker theme. Except that only Blumenthal took that claim seriously enough to actually label Lewinsky a stalker in the menacing rather than colloquial sense. According to Hitchens, Blumenthal told Hitchens' wife that he only gave credence to the stalker account because the president told me. He then followed up that stunning admission with an even worse admission. I could go to jail for what I'm doing now. Apostates like Hitchens are given the most egregious treatment by the complex. The Clintonistas labeled him a drunk and a traitor to the cause. The next step was for Blumenthal to recruit some of his intellectual friends to write that the Republicans were somehow engaging in a sexual inquisition, despite the fact that it was Clinton who had made the details of his sexual peccadillos relevant by committing perjury about them. Blumenthal instructed friends of Clinton's to write long pieces that all had the same meme, that the repressed conservatives were obsessed with a president who had a European view of sex. These pieces opened the door for the academic and pop cultural worlds to begin echoing the slogan, "It's just about the sex." One of Blumenthal's buddies was Colombian Nobel Prize-winning novelist Gabriel Garcia Marquez. On January 30th, 1999, Garcia Marquez penned a piece for the UK Guardian defending Clinton. The title of the piece? Why My Friend Bill Had to Lie. Garcia Marquez began by discussing Clinton's magnetism, then his status as a cultural icon. At 49, he was a glorious survivor of the generation of 68, someone who had smoked dope and sung along to the Beatles, someone who had taken to the streets in protest at the Vietnam War. What any of this had to do with Clinton ejaculating his DNA into and onto a White House intern was left unspoken. At last, Garcia Marquez tackled the question of the hour. Why did Clinton have to lie? Clinton had to lie, Garcia Marquez said, because as Clinton himself told Garcia Marquez, my only enemy is right-wing religious fundamentalism. Then Garcia Marquez got into full bore. Is it right that this exceptional human man should have his place in history distorted because he couldn't find a secluded spot in which to make love? The president only wanted to do what the common man has done behind his wife's back since the world began. Puritan stupidity did not only refuse him that, it withheld his right to deny it. But what of his perjury? Garcia Marquez dismissed it out of hand. Surely it is more dignified to perjure yourself in defense of carnal desire than to condemn love altogether. Clinton was innocent, said Garcia Marquez. The right wing was to blame. Because Puritanism is an insatiable vice that feeds off its own shit. The entire impeachment process has been a sinister plot by fanatics for the personal destruction of a political adversary whose grandeur they could not bear. According to Garcia Marquez, Clinton's enemies were straight from Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, and not only that, they were secret racists. Toni Morrison, a Nobel Prize winner and one of the greatest writers of this dying century, sums it up in one inspired flourish. They have treated Clinton as if he was a black president. Garcia Marquez was just one of Clinton's highbrow defenders recruited by Blumenthal. Another was Alan Dershowitz, who wrote an entire book defending Clinton entitled Sexual McCarthyism. On NBC, he said, "Remember, it was sexual McCarthyism that J. Edgar Hoover used to try to get Martin Luther King." William Styron, author of Sophie's Choice, focused on the sophisticated European reaction to the Lewinsky scandal. I have been very intent on the reaction of Europeans, and they are almost uniformly devastated by this. They realize how deadly serious it is. Jack Lang, former French Minister of Culture, joined the club. Tyranny begins when one power, one church, one party introduces itself into the private life of its citizens. The coincidence of messaging was too perfect not to be orchestrated from the top. This had been a story about Clinton lying to the American people, forcing witnesses into silence, and breaking faith with the constitutional order. Now it was a story about evil Republican oppressors with secret sexual issues trying to drag Bill Clinton's open-minded sex life out of the closet and thrust it upon the American people. Suddenly, Clinton was a hero, and the Republicans trying to impeach him for high crimes and misdemeanors were the villains. It was brilliant. To this point, the media were doing what they had always done. Though left of center historically, they did have some boundaries of civility, but now, in 1998, the Clinton administration, through its attempts to save a presidency at any and all costs, experimented with the new media, particularly the well-funded San Francisco-based upstart Salon.com. There, government and a publication with nothing to lose and an ideological kinship conspired to do things that were previously considered off-limits. It started with the Clinton apparatchiks hiring private detectives to dig up information about their political enemies. In February 1998, private detective Terry Lenzner, along with Blumenthal, was subpoenaed before a federal grand jury for trying to find damaging material on Kenneth Starr's prosecutors. Clinton's attorneys acknowledged that Lenzner was on their payroll. In Washington, he was called the head of Bill Clinton's private CIA. Kenneth Starr, who stayed admirably quiet during the entire Clinton investigation, released a statement. This office has received repeated press inquiries indicating that misinformation is being spread about personnel involved in this investigation. We are using traditional and appropriate techniques to find out who is responsible and whether their actions are intended to intimidate prosecutors and investigators, impede the work of the grand jury, or otherwise obstruct justice. Naturally, Lenzner played victim, and the White House, according to the New York Times, denounced the questioning of Mr. Blumenthal and Mr. Lenzner as a vindictive campaign by Mr. Starr and his deputies to intimidate the president's aides and associates and to chill the White House's relations with the press. White House officials assailed Mr. Starr's efforts to force Mr. Blumenthal to reveal his contacts with reporters as an assault on the Constitution. Rahm Emanuel, yes, that Rahm Emanuel, came to the defense of all the president's thugs, jabbering, "There is no legal right he will not trample on in his partisan political pursuit of the president. When we have seen this abuse of power in other countries, we have been outraged. When you see it at home, you are left speechless. It is brazen abuse." Nobody in the media thought to ask whether it was brazen abuse to hire detectives to pressure prosecuting attorneys. This, of course, was common practice for the Clintons. The Clintons had at one time or another hired Terry Lenzner, Private Eye Jack Palladino, and Private Eye Anthony Pellicano to do this kind of dirty work. Pellicano had allegedly been hired by Hillary in 1992 to discredit Jennifer Flowers. Palladino had been used to silence women during the campaign. The Clinton Election Committee paid him $93,000 to investigate the women. According to Betsy Wright, one of Clinton's aides, Palladino even went so far as to create an affidavit or two linking Flowers to a conservative conspiracy. It wasn't surprising that the Clintons were able to come up with mud on their political opponents. Blumenthal then disseminated that information through his Rolodex as fast as he possibly could. Once they got to the bottom of the barrel, in terms of mud, though, once they got to the material that no responsible editor could ever justify as mildly relevant to anything, the material that they couldn't go to the Washington Post or the New York Times with, the Clintons went to their alternative medium. That alternative medium was Salon.com. The same Salon.com that is based in San Francisco, the Salon.com where all the editors knew the strategies of the alt-weeklies I had read back in Venice, the outing and the politics of personal destruction. They knew those strategies because they were those strategies. It was Salon.com that first reported on August 5, 1998, that the Clinton administration was going to employ a sexual scorched earth plan. Die-hard Clinton loyalists are spreading the word that a long-ignored but fearsome tactic has now resurfaced as an element in the president's survival strategy. The threat of exposing the sexual improprieties of Republican critics, both in Congress and beyond, should they demand impeachment hearings in the House. "We're talking about the doomsday machine here," one close ally of the president told Salon, alluding to the unstoppable chain of retaliatory nuclear strikes in the movie Dr. Strangelove. "Once the doomsday machine is set in motion, there will be no stopping it. The Republicans with skeletons in their closets must assume everything is known and will come out. So the question is, do they really want to go there?" On September 16, 1998, David Talbot, a Hollywood kid, his father Lyle headed up the Screen Actors Guild, and San Francisco journalist, ran a story on Salon.com about Representative Henry Hyde, head of the House Judiciary Committee. The story had nothing to do with Hyde's qualifications. It had to do with an affair Hyde had had 30 years before with Cherie Snodgrass. Talbot made clear that Hyde was being outed as a decades-old adulterer because Hyde's committee will decide whether the adulterous affair President Clinton carried on with a White House intern and his efforts to keep it hidden should be referred to the House of Representatives for impeachment proceedings. Hyde admitted the 1965 to 1969 affair to Salon.com, but pointed out how irrelevant the story was to anything at issue in the Clinton investigation. "The statute of limitations has long since passed on my youthful indiscretions. The only purpose for this being dredged up now is an obvious attempt to intimidate me, and it won't work." Salon.com even tracked down Cherie's adult daughter, who made clear that she was speaking out because of Hyde's role in the Clinton impeachment. "My mother originally didn't want me to say anything to the press, but she's just so fed up with Hyde, with how two-faced he is. She hates his anti-abortion stuff and all the family values stuff. She thinks he's bad for the country. He's too powerful and he's hypocritical." The editors at Salon.com knew that the Hyde story was totally extraneous to the Clinton situation and that it was a gratuitous smear designed to get Hyde and the rest of the constitutionally mandated impeachment managers to back off Clinton and, more important, to intimidate others from pursuing an honest outcome. Because Salon.com was flacking for the Clinton White House and appeared to be getting their scoops from them, they felt it necessary to disassociate themselves so that Clinton wouldn't feel the blowback. The White House had nothing whatsoever to do with any aspect of this story. We did not receive it from anyone in the White House or in Clinton's political or legal camps, nor did we communicate with them about it. Sure. The truly incredible part of the Salon.com editorial was its explanation of why it would release the information. Where the mainstream media had turned it down flat, even they wouldn't stoop this low, at least not yet. Norm Summer, the supposed source of the scoop, had tried to pitch the story to the Los Angeles Times, the Boston Globe, and the Miami Herald. Salon ran with it. The question again was why? In a different and better world, we would not have released this story. Throughout the tragic farce of the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal, we have strongly argued that the private lives of all Americans, whether they are public figures or not, should remain sacrosanct. But Clinton's enemies have changed the rules. In the brave new world that has been created by the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal, the private lives of public figures are no longer off limits, the editors wrote. This was patent nonsense, of course. If Salon wanted the private lives of public figures to remain private, the worst way to achieve that was by releasing the private details of Henry Hyde's 30 years past sexual liaisons. The real reason was easy. Salon released the information in order to decimate Clinton's detractors. Salon's editors explained on the site, "Aren't we fighting fire with fire, descending to the gutter tactics of those we deplore? Frankly, yes. But ugly times call for ugly tactics. When a pack of sanctimonious thugs beats you and your country upside the head with a tire iron, you can withdraw to the sideline and meditate, or you can grab it out of their hands and fight back." With Salon.com tearing the lid off a can of Ebola bacteria, the Hustler publisher Larry Flynt got busy too. The year before, Hollywood had produced an ode to Flynt starring Woody Harrelson, The People vs. Larry Flynt, which had anti-hero Woody telling America, "I think the real obscenity comes from raising our youth to believe that sex is bad and ugly and dirty, and yet it is heroic to go spill guts and blood in the most ghastly manner in the name of humanity." With all the taboos attached to sex, it's no wonder we have the problems we have. It's no wonder we're angry and violent and genocidal. So Larry Flynt, now somehow a First Amendment icon getting a pass from the ladies of now, decided on October 4th, 1998, to offer $1 million to anyone who would reveal damaging sexual information about congressional Republicans in an ad in the Washington Post. His purpose was to defend Clinton, just like his friends and allies at Salon.com. No matter what channel I turned the television to, it was Bash Clinton night, Flynt wrote in his autobiography, Sex, Lies, and Politics, The Naked Truth. Everybody wanted his head on a platter, and I thought it was grossly unfair. He hadn't robbed the country's treasury. He hadn't committed treason. At worst, he got a blowjob in the Oval Office, and like any married man caught under those circumstances, he lied to cover his ass. Larry, in full political operative mode, went on. We received some very colorful leads that we ended up not pursuing, he wrote in 2004, because our interest was exclusively in finding and exposing the hypocrites. I wasn't interested in trashing somebody's sex life just because they were having an affair or they were into something kinky. I only wanted to expose people who were crucifying Clinton for doing the same thing they were. The first person Flynt exposed was presumptive Speaker of the House Bob Livingston, Republican from Louisiana, who Flynt revealed had serially cheated on his wife. Roll Call, the Capitol Hill newspaper, picked up the story right away. Next was Representative Bob Barr, Republican from Georgia. Flynt said that Barr had paid for his wife's abortion and committed adultery. Barr had never denied committing adultery, but he did deny that he had encouraged his wife to have an abortion. Flynt said that Barr had committed perjury too, except that Barr had refused to answer questions, which is not the same as committing perjury. Barr's scandal was covered everywhere. As this tactic gained momentum, the mainstream media finally decided it was safe to get on board. Representative Helen Chenoweth, Republican from Idaho, admitted to the Idaho Statesman that she had had a long-time sexual relationship with an associate named Vernon Ravenscroft. For being totally unjustifiable as a news story, this was probably the most egregious of these so-called exposés. Chenoweth was single, and she wasn't a member of Congress when she had the sexual liaison. Salon.com chortled. To her regret, she discovered that making your private morality a story by questioning the president's is a really bad campaign idea. Representative Dan Burton, a Republican from Indiana, outed himself he had fathered an illegitimate kid in the 1980s in order to avoid being targeted by Vanity Fair. As Salon.com triumphantly wrote, unnerved by the thoroughness with which independent journalist Russ Baker and others have been probing his apparently active life, Burton outed himself. Believing Baker's piece was going to be in the upcoming Vanity Fair, Burton decided to cryptically pseudo-confess a slew of past sins with a kind of preemptive strike. Americans thought all this was disgusting, just like I did. A poll in the Washington Post showed that only 40% of Americans approved of Flynt's mission to reveal extramarital affairs by Republicans. 57% disapproved. Only 46% of Americans said the mainstream media should report such scandals, with 52% saying no. For the complex, this campaign was the John Philip Sousa Stars and Stripes Forever, the end of the fireworks display on the 4th of July, when you hear pop, pop, pop. Except that when you looked around, you saw bodies strewn all over the place, the bodies of conservatives, and every one of their closeted peccadillos smeared across their corpses. I looked around and said to myself, what the hell just happened? The Republican Party itself refused to acknowledge that it was happening. While the counter-media, the Drudge Report and Lucien Goldberg and Rush Limbaugh, were leading the charge against the campaign, the Republicans, except for those few people who went about their business pursuing the articles of impeachment, ran for the hills. The institutionalized conservative movement, and specifically Newt Gingrich, were conspicuously silent. They knew they were in no position to be going after Clinton for impeachment, even though it was on legal grounds, because they had allowed the left to turn the media narrative into one of sexual inquisition. They didn't want to put themselves in harm's way. The people pushing for impeachment were like today's Tea Partiers, men and women who are pushing their representatives, telling them over and over again, no, you guys have to have courage, and if you're going to be in the battle, you have to know you're going to take bullets too. It was watching the Republican Party run from their responsibility to their constituents in order to save themselves that caused me to cultivate a more limited respect for them. I looked at the one guy who stood up, knowing he'd be isolated, Representative Jim Rogan, Republican from California, and they decimated him even as Republicans fled around him. Rogan was the American dream, a guy who had spent time on welfare, who raised himself up and eventually ended up in Congress, and they destroyed him unmercifully. The Clintonistas, as they are commonly referred to for their revolutionary media battle tactics, put a hit out on Rogan, using outsized resources to target him in his next election. The payback is not just payback. Again, it is a warning to anyone else that politics to these people is a blood sport, and if you cross them, you will pay dearly. This was when I recognized that the next Republican president was going to be isolated for attack. The message was that the complex still controlled the big guns, and if you punched them, they'd punch back twice as hard. George W. Bush's fate was preordained. To the nation, the media's Clinton-created response to the Lewinsky scandal was a turning point. They had been the Edward R. Murrow wannabes, the guys who idolized Woodward and Bernstein. Now they were open partisan hacks, digging up as much dirt as possible whenever possible. That became even more clear to me 2 years later, when, absent the ugly times require ugly measures excuse, Salon.com ran a piece by Dan Savage, the radical gay left columnist from the Pacific Northwest. Savage infiltrated then-presidential candidate Gary Bauer's Iowa campaign at the caucus level and, under the guise of being a conservative Christian, got a job for 1 month to help out. Savage described how, sick in bed watching television, he'd devised his plan. Watching Bauer on MSNBC, he saw Bauer state, "Our society will be destroyed if we say it's okay for a man to marry a man or a woman to marry a woman." It isn't exactly news to those of us who have lived outside San Francisco that religious conservatives feel this way, but it was news to Savage. In my Sudafed-induced delirium, I decided that if it's terrorism Bauer wants, then it's terrorism Bauer is going to get, and I'm just the man to terrorize him. Naked, feverish, and higher than a kite on codeine aspirin, I called the Bauer campaign and volunteered. My plan? Get close enough to Bauer to give him the flu, which, if I am successful, will lay him flat just before the New Hampshire primary. I would go to Bauer's campaign office and cough on everything. Phones and pens, staplers, and staffers. I even hatched a plan to infect the candidate himself. My plan was a little malicious, even a little mean-spirited, but those same words describe the tactics used by Bauer and the rest of the religious right against gays and lesbians. He spent the rest of the piece describing with glee how he applied his bodily fluids to the entire office. He licked the front door, office doors, even a bathroom door, the staplers, phones, and computer keyboards, the rims of all the clean coffee cups drying in the rack. Then he chewed on a pen and handed it to Bauer. This is not journalism. It's not even the third-grade ramblings of a snot-nosed booger eater. It's the vicious actions of a perverse, degraded, and disgusting human being. And Salon ran it without question. Why? It was savage, no pun intended, powerful writing, Swiftian in its desperate satiric outrage at anti-gay discrimination. In other words, the ends justify the means. This was Salon.com. It wasn't like this was an alt weekly with ads for hand jobs. For many people, this was a respected publication. that these people allowed for such a story to be published, sending the message that it was open season on Christian conservatives, without so much as a Columbia journalism